Welcome, everyone. I hate to bust up the visiting, but I'm going to, because we have a great day ahead of us, and I want to get started, and started in a timely way. So I want to welcome everyone this morning. I know many of you were here last night, and it was just a wonderful start to this symposium in honor of David Getches. And I first want to thank the Dean's Office. When last summer I told Phil Weiser that this is what I really did want to do for David, because you know, I'm a nerdy academic, and I couldn't think of a better way to honor someone than by spending a whole day talking about their work. So that's really what I wanted to do. And Dean Weiser was supportive from the very first second I mentioned it. And the Dean's Office funded this entirely, which is really no small thing in these times, and just made it so much easier to just do the planning and do all the important things to make this come together. So I want to thank the Dean's Office. I want to thank our amazing students. I know some of you have had a chance to meet some of them. I couldn't have done this without their support. Anne Mariah, in particular, rallied all the students to help drive our illustrious speakers to and from and here and there. And she's just been outstanding throughout, especially in the last week of classes when her finals are about to begin. So I really appreciate her and the other analysis students' efforts. The Colorado Law Review is publishing the papers, which will be terrific. So please look for the symposium issue, and I want to thank the review for agreeing to publish the papers from this symposium and for doing the work and helping out with the conference as well. Cheryl Franchi has been our assistant in charge of pulling off these events, and I want to thank Cheryl too. Finally, Anne Getches and her family have been very, very supportive and kind throughout. I told both Katie and Matt last night that once in a while I worry that they're getting kind of tired of this. Like, can we stop honoring Dad finally? And I am not getting the sense, at least as of today, that that's the case, and I'm so glad. I feel like you're very generous with your support and your time and allowing us to sort of do what we all need to do to honor David's memory. Okay, so those are all the thank yous. Just briefly, I know a few of you saw the word Festschrift floating around in various places in the program and wondered what that was, and I know, in fact, that Justice Hobbs saw the word and said, what the heck is that, and what am I supposed to do at a Festschrift? So I thought I'd explain very briefly. It's a tradition in other disciplines that you would take a day and honor a very senior person in the field and bring in speakers who could reflect on their work and hopefully also produce new ideas about their work. And we thought this would just be the perfect way to think about David's body of work. Now, with most academics, you have one field to address and think about, but David, in his scholarly life, as in the rest of his life, seemed to live several lives in one. And so we couldn't just do one field, and that's why today we have 3 panels on land, water, and American Indian law. And we probably could have thought of more, but then, you know, the day was already full. So to do David's work justice, we have these 3 panels. A number of you have been very generous in thanking me and Charles for bringing in all these wonderful people. I have to tell you that it was really very easy because when we called the very top people in the field, the hard part, I should say, was leaving some people out, including many of you here in the audience. All right, that was the hard part. It was like, oh, who not to include? But when we called the people we did want to include at the end of the day, really it couldn't have been easier. And that's another testament to David's life and work, is that all of you here were so willing to drop everything, and I know many of you had to drop several things, to be here and to help us think through the meaning of the legacy of David's work, bring forth new ideas, and help us think about where we're all going to go from here based on this really impressive body of thinking, writing, and scholarship that David has done. So we're going to start now this morning with John Leshy. You have everybody's bio, so I won't go on at length, and that's a relief because one could go on at quite some length about all the speakers, including John. John, I'll just say, is, as you all know, the former solicitor in the Department of the Interior, and he wrote many very important opinions and made a lot of important decisions when he was at Interior that if only some of them had even more sticking power in the next administration, I think our public lands policy and water policy and Indian policy in the West would have been really substantially transformed. And still, there are important legacies from his time there. I'll just say that when I first met John, which was at a public land law conference here a couple of years ago, I instantly got it as to why he is who he is in the field. And that's because I just got this feeling talking to him even briefly and even sort of sitting next to him that his brain was like throwing off sparks. There just was so much action in there that it was unbelievable, in fact, that he could contain it. And so I realized, oh, this is why he's managed to accomplish everything that he has. So thanks so much to John, and we're looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Thanks, Sarah. When Sarah and Charles called me about appearing today, they very generously said, well, you can talk about anything you want to. And so I'm going to exploit that generous invitation. And I will talk about David's career and his legacy, but somewhat indirectly. Our dear friend, David Getches, was deprived of a full opportunity to take a reflective look back at his life of good works. But as Charles noted in some detail yesterday, he led by example. And his career provides rich material for reflecting about law and social change and how we, and particularly rising generations, might deal with the challenges that lie before us. And that's what I want to offer some thoughts about along that line this morning. The story of David's career is really the story of an entire generation of activists who came of age in what is quaintly called now the 60s, the era of Martin Luther King, civil rights, Vietnam, and a little later Earth Day and the first modern emergence of the modern environmental movement. And yes, the sexual revolution. I was reminded of that the other day when somebody sent me a cartoon of two old guys sitting on a park bench feeding the birds, and one of them turned to the other and said, do you know that stuff they gave us during the war to make us not think about women? And the other one said, yeah. The guy said, I think it's beginning to work. Well, it was an era when a significant number of people, especially the young, became disaffected from the mainstream establishment because they thought the government was deaf to mighty forces of change that were coursing through society. Some followed Timothy Leary and turned on, tuned in, turned on, and dropped out. Some may have tuned in and turned on but didn't drop out, and chose instead to work to reform the established order. Lawyers like David became advocates for people and causes underserved or disadvantaged by the status quo. One such cause concerned the rights of Native American tribes and peoples. Another concerned how we manage natural resources, particularly lands and waters. And I very much look forward to hearing what the many distinguished commentators that Sarah and Charles have assembled to honor David's career have to say on these subjects over the course of the day. These reform efforts were, by many measures, remarkably successful. Tribal sovereignty is more protected. Indian tribal governments are stronger than they've been in many, many decades. And if the cause of Native Americans is considered as part of a broader movement, the depth of these changes is profound. An African American president, unfathomable in the 60s, is the most obvious indicator. Today, most of America's major institutions not only tolerate, but welcome and indeed celebrate racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, and many other forms of diversity in America. There is much more to do, of course, but the victories in the struggles for civil rights, tolerance, and respect for human dignity might rightly be called the greatest moral achievement of the last century. Gains are also apparent in the other major focus of David's professional career, managing natural resources and protecting the environment. The legal system governing these resources once served a relatively narrow range of interests, neglecting broader concerns. By contrast, today, the idea that resource management must not only respect the needs of the natural environment, but of all people who in some way may rely on these resources, that idea is deeply embedded throughout our legal system. In short, in a myriad of ways, the law now routinely takes into account considerations of Indian sovereignty and environmental protection in ways that could barely be imagined in 1967, the year that David graduated from law school. As a nation, we can and should take great pride in this. It's a credit not only to reform advocates like David, but more generally to the capacity of our politics and our legal system to accommodate broad currents of change to meet new challenges, to translate legitimate concerns into effective rules and policies. So what can we learn from these experiences as we turn toward the future? One lesson is that reforms can sometimes veer off in unanticipated ways with unexpected benefits and costs. Who could have predicted that the promotion of tribal sovereignty would help create an enterprise, gaming, that would grow into the most important economic engine ever devised for Indian country, generating some $25 billion a year revenue annually, and along the way transform the politics of Indian policymaking in profound ways? The effects are not totally positive. Gaming has weakened national political support for tribal aspirations, especially for those tribes bypassed by gaming. But on balance, its effects have been positive. Most tribes, most of the time, have handled their economic success very well, using it to reinvigorate tribal culture and traditions and smartly to reduce economic dependence on gaming. Another lesson is that successful reform strategies and tactics can sow the seeds of counter-reformation, and our political system has been plastic enough to allow this to happen. For example, the work of David and his colleagues on behalf of Native Americans initially depended heavily on litigation, on persuading judges to apply old or invent new legal concepts to advance their cause. In this, they were emulating, of course, the classic strategy of the NAACP, whose long campaign to end separate but equal culminated in Brown versus Board of Education. Now, defenders of the established order and their allies responded to these successes by launching efforts to recapture the courts through the appointments process and to establish organizations like the Mountain States and Pacific Legal Foundations to counter groups like Native American Rights Fund and Earth Justice. In recent decades, these responses have made considerable headway on issues like affirmative action, protection of property rights, limiting government's regulatory reach, and restricting legal standing to sue. American courts today are, I think it's fair to say, more sympathetic to conservative arguments than progressive ones. In this, the courts have, one might argue, returned to their more accustomed and comfortable position. They, and indeed the law itself, have a cultural conservative kind of bias, grounded in rules and orderliness and stability that inevitably tilts toward the status quo. The court's relatively brief role in the vanguard of reform efforts a few decades ago, in other words, was more of a historical aberration than a secure path. Any reform strategy based primarily in litigation, in other words, may not be easy to sustain unless political support for its objectives is engendered along the way. To be sure, David's generation of activists successfully tapped into and fostered political support. Just as Brown versus Board of Education led to civil rights legislation in the 60s, court decisions promoting tribal sovereignty helped pave the way for a spate of legislation in support of tribal self-determination. And early environmental litigation helped pave the way for a spate of environmental legislation in the 70s and early 80s. Now, the wheels of political change continue to turn. Organizations are created to counter the counter-reformers, proving once again that imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. The Federalist Society's success in moving judicial selection and legal scholarship to the right gives rise to the American Constitution Society, which seeks to move them back leftward. The success of right-leaning advocacy groups like the American Enterprise and Cato Institutes gives rise to the Center for American Progress on the left. Regardless of where one stands on the political spectrum, all this back and forth is hardly a bad thing. It illustrates the genius of America's complex, pluralistic political system, where power is diffused and many levers can be pulled to affect the course of events. That our society not only tolerates but encourages the clash of ideas and perspectives is, of course, one of its great strengths, helping to make it the envy of the world. In recent years, however, a new and grave challenge to our political system has emerged: the increasingly dominant role of money in politics, particularly electoral politics. For a variety of reasons, the cost of campaigning for people and causes has become astronomical, and the money to pay for it is increasingly coming from a relatively small group of people. The infusion of vast sums of money from a comparative handful is really overwhelming the public policy-making process. Its effects are visible every day, not only in campaigns, but in the gridlock that paralyzes our government, making compromise next to impossible. Most pernicious is how just about everybody aspiring to or running for office, significant public office, is required to spend the great bulk of his or her time and energy in an unseemly effort to raise ever larger sums of money. The magnitude of the task would shock, I think, the average American. If you're elected to the U.S. Senate from a relatively populous state today, in November, and aspire to run for another term, you must, in order to mount a credible re-election campaign 6 years from now, raise something on the order of $25,000 to $50,000 every single day for the next 6 years. This endless search for money leads politicians to develop, as Harvard Law professor Larry Lessig has put it, quote, to develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness of how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. Chasing money crowds out the time available for lawmakers to discharge their basic responsibilities, learning issues, listening to reasoned advocacy, pondering the public good, getting to know constituents and colleagues, looking for common ground among competing interests, and building bridges across partisan divides. These are not original observations, of course. The case has been made effectively in a number of recent books, like Lessig's Republic Lost. He points out the problem is not really Tammany Hall style graft and corruption. It is that the money-dependent political system does not allow politicians, who, whatever their ideology, are mostly good people, to do the public's business. The tsunami of money and the politicians need to get it are corrupting our nation's capacity to govern itself effectively. They make the political system more rigid, more protective of established interests, and less accommodating to emerging needs. This rise in the role of money, ironically, owes a considerable debt to the activism of the 60s, which strengthened our society's commitment to free speech, primarily to protect advocates for change in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. This helped pave the way for a slim majority of the current Supreme Court to take the simple, and to my way of thinking, simplistic view that money equals speech. It would be wrong to place the entire blame for our current problem on the Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United and its kin, but with them, 5 justices have sharply limited the power of government to control or neutralize the role of money in politics. Equating money with speech could not have come at a worse time, frankly. In the last 30 years, the gap between the very rich and everyone else in our country has steadily widened. It is now a chasm, bigger than it has been in many, many decades, bigger indeed than in almost every other developed nation on earth. Many statistics tell this tale. Here are just 2. Over the last 3 decades, out of every dollar of increased national income, 20 cents went to the top 0.1% of Americans. 13.5 cents went to the bottom 60% of Americans. In the same era, the compensation of CEOs of America's largest companies went from 30 times the average salary of the average worker to 300 times the salary of the average worker in that company. Over the same span, as I've noted, the cost of running for office is vastly inflated. The result, campaigns are increasingly dependent on the wealthy. A mere 1% of Americans contribute more than 2/3 of all federal campaign money. The top 100th of 1% contribute 1/4 of the total campaign money. Put a little differently, for every $100 that the most wealthy 100th of 1% of Americans give to political campaigns, the bottom 99% gives 1 penny. Every study I know of shows that, and this amazing imbalance does not really reflect altruism at the top. We shouldn't kid ourselves about that. Every study I know of shows that lower income Americans give a higher percentage of their income to charity than the wealthy do. So far in the current presidential election cycle, of the many millions of dollars spent so far by groups technically not affiliated with any candidate, those are the super PACs and organizations like that, something like 80% of that money has come from 200 individuals. This is in a country of 310 million people. As one wag put it, if you're looking for a handy slogan, that would be the 63 millionth of 1%. The late conservative commentator William F. Buckley once famously said he'd rather be governed by the first 200 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty of Harvard University. Maybe he was right about the Harvard faculty. He was a Yaley after all, but is it any better to have 200 wealthy individuals wield such influence when most of this money is now raised through devices that shield the identity of those giving the money? The problem will not be easy to fix. The first step is to agree that we have a problem, and we're not there yet. Now, another big challenge to our governing system currently was also unwittingly fostered by the 60s reformers, and that's the low esteem in which government is held by the citizenry. Like all reform movements, 60s reformers tended to paint government as an enemy of change. This is natural. Reformers want to change government policy, and government, like any large institution, has built-in resistance to change. The crisis of confidence in government in America today is, of course, related to the first problem of money. The chase for campaign funds feeds the popular notion that politicians are bought by moneyed interests, which in turn feeds disillusionment with the government. Recall what Ronald Reagan said in 1977. Politics is supposed to be the second oldest profession, he said. I've come to realize it bears a very close resemblance to the first. Is it any wonder that Congress's approval rating today is in the single digits and that 80% of Americans say they've lost trust in government? In this connection, let me nominate as one of the most wrong-headed statements ever to appear in a Supreme Court opinion, the one by Justice Kennedy for the 5-justice majority in Citizens United. The appearance of influence or access when persons or corporations give money to politicians, he said, will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. This breathtaking lack of vision brings to mind the Federal Reserve Board's chair's Alan Greenspan's stubborn belief that self-interest of the financial wizards on Wall Street and elsewhere would prevent them from using their freedom from government regulation to run the world economy off a cliff. After the financial sector seized up in the fall of 2008, Greenspan famously confessed the error of his ways in testimony to Congress. Justice Kennedy and his allies on the court have yet to follow suit. There's no sign they actually have any second thoughts. While attacking government is a staple of reform advocacy, indeed a staple of American culture, there is, to my way of thinking, a profound difference between saying that government policies need to be changed so that the government can help solve problems, and saying that government cannot solve problems but can only make them worse. As 60s reformers were attacking government for being unresponsive, another group of reformers promoting free markets and private property were doing the same. But the objective of at least some of these people was to get government out of the way of the private sector, a sentiment neatly captured by President Reagan in his first inaugural address, when he said, "Government is not the solution to our problem, it is the problem," a sentiment still often heard on the campaign trail. As Alan Greenspan, Richard Posner, and many others have noted, we now understand that this belief that if the government simply got out of the way, the private sector would lead us to an ever greater prosperity, paved the way for the financial meltdown in 2008 and the most severe economic distress in 3/4 of a century. Even before that meltdown, loss of confidence in government had set up a kind of vicious cycle. Large tax cuts destroyed the budget surplus the country briefly enjoyed at the turn of the millennium. We ought to hand the people's money back to them, President Bush said. Compare that to Oliver Wendell Holmes' taxes are what we pay for a civilized society. The ensuing deficits, compounded by 2 wars carried off the books at the Treasury, has further impaired the capacity of our government to govern. Now, one reason government is the enemy rhetoric succeeds, of course, is because of ignorance. You all recall, "Keep the government's hands off my Medicare." That was the line going around during the health care reform debate. In 2008, Cornell served a broad cross-section of Americans. More than half of them reported they had never used a government program. It turned out 94% had. The average respondent had used 4 different government programs. The problem of ignorance is made worse, of course, by the atomization of the media. There are no widely trusted avuncular figures like Walter Cronkite to earlier generations to provide completely or relatively unbiased information. Well, bashing the government, we can all agree, is easy. We've all seen its shortcomings up close. You only have to look at the recent annex of the General Services Administration in Las Vegas or the Secret Service in Colombia, etc. But we need to keep the government failings in perspective. The United States remains one of the most free countries on the planet. Our government is more protective of private property rights than almost any other nation on earth. And even though the political process is awash in money, our government is actually remarkably free from old-fashioned actual corruption and graft. Now, government alone cannot solve the problems and challenges ahead. I've never argued that. Capitalism and free markets can do wondrous things, bringing us wealth and consumer products and a standard of living practically unimaginable to our forebears. But they alone cannot solve our problems, any more than prayer, meditation, drugs, diet, or exercise can. History shows that government must play a critical role. Most Americans, I think, agree with that because relatively few, a tiny fraction, only a tiny fraction, support libertarian candidates. Consider the vast decline in waterborne diseases after the government built public water supply and sanitation systems, or the vast improvement in the economic status of senior citizens since government instituted Social Security. The tremendous disparity in the distribution of wealth seen today ironically followed one of American government's most notable achievements, helping vastly expand America's middle class in the half century leading up to 1980 through its educational, labor, social, and health policies. Because the government does and will continue to do essential things, it needs to have resources and attract people capable of doing the job. The loss in the faith of government has led, unfortunately, to a disparagement and devaluation of public service. Working in government, not just in the military, ought to be honored, not scorned. Rebuilding faith in government and the value of public service is one of the biggest challenges before us. Nowhere is the need for effective government engagement more apparent than in the biggest problem the Earth faces today, the one that our grandchildren and maybe even our children will be least likely to forgive us for not addressing adequately. I refer, of course, to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. As I noted earlier on the environmental issues that David Getches devoted attention to, public lands and water and other natural resources, there's much that might be called a success. Compared to when he graduated from law school in 1967, these resources are, generally speaking, much better managed. Not only are the air and water cleaner, but we no longer mine and log and drill with scant regard for effects on other interests and values. We pay a good deal of protective attention to species besides our own. But if the climate crisis Cassandras, and many credible Earth scientists fall in this category, turn out to be correct, all these achievements might be looked back upon in just a generation or two as accomplishing little more than rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I simply had to use that metaphor. It's only, 2 weeks ago was the 100th anniversary, right? A destabilizing climate could change everything in very, very significant and mostly deleterious ways, all within the lifespan of many people in this room, and certainly within the lifespan of my new granddaughter born earlier this year. Noted climate scientist James Hansen has said it would be immoral to leave these young people, referring to his grandchildren, with a climate system spiraling out of control, but that is exactly what we are on a path to do. This challenge could dwarf all others mankind faces. It requires action by government at all levels around the globe. If we do not act soon to start remaking our infrastructure to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, we might find ourselves, in the words of one climate scientist, back in the late Cretaceous, except this time we'll be the dinosaurs. But our government is paralyzed and our political system incapacitated, in large part because of the problems I've mentioned: the corrupting effects of money, the loss of confidence in government, the devaluation of public service. Among other things, a small number of wealthy people and institutions have worked to create a false but effective counter-narrative that no scientific consensus exists on the perils of greenhouse gas emissions. By some polls, the number of Americans who believe in anthropogenic climate change has substantially diminished in recent years, despite steadily mounting evidence to the contrary. Practically all the significant figures in one of our two major national political parties now seem, lamentably, to subscribe to this view. The lamestream media, to borrow Sarah Palin's phrase, too often fail to report the existence of that overwhelming worldwide scientific consensus. Commercial media companies shrink from the obvious. The latest example is interesting. New York Times a few days ago, describing how a Discovery Channel recently aired a documentary on melting polar ice caps without once mentioning greenhouse gas emissions, because the producers said they didn't want to create controversy or to alienate those who simply refuse to believe humans have anything to do with it. Bill McKibben said, "This is sort of like doing a powerful documentary about lung cancer and leaving out that part about the cigarettes." Young people have the most at stake in this struggle. There are some hopeful signs they are beginning to engage, for there is no time to lose. Let me close by suggesting that instead of all joining hands and jumping off the nearest cliff, or remembering we're in Boulder off the nearest Flatiron, that we ponder three of David Getches' notable strengths, because they can help us guide us out of this corner in which we find ourselves if we have the wisdom to follow his example. One is that he was engaged. He did not simply sit in his office and write. He knew it was rare for a law review article or a book to contain ideas powerful enough to change the course of events. That usually happens only from active, indeed strenuous, indeed committed, and continuous engagement. And David's form of engagement is also instructive. As Charles described yesterday, he did not toil away on problems where success is measured only in dollars. He represented underserved interests. A good portion of his talents and energy was devoted to helping craft constructive solutions to policy problems. He helped build and guide and nurture institutions doing good works. He did a turn state government, running the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Second, for much of his career, David was an educator. Education is, of course, essential to a well-functioning economy and a good society. It remains an important responsibility of government at all levels. David himself was a public educator and a public servant for most of his career. In that capacity, he helped inform younger generations about how our legal and political systems operate, and he equipped many with the zeal, advocacy skills, and other tools to go out and make a difference. Finally, David was an optimist. He believed that people are mostly of goodwill, and that they can be persuaded to work together to fashion a better world, and that the political system can be made to work to lift us all to higher ground. Although our system seems to be doing its best today to avoid confronting the challenges we face, history shows that dramatic turnarounds are possible in a relatively short period of time. The progressive movement, which crafted many innovations that we today take for granted, followed quite abruptly on the heels of what Mark Twain dubbed the Gilded Age, where American politics and society were corrupted by moneyed narrow special interests. We're all deeply privileged to have known David Getches and to have shared his fellowship through times of great change. David maintained his spirit of engagement, his commitment to education, learning, and improvement, and his irrepressible optimism to the end. We should let his example sustain and guide us as we confront the challenges ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And now I'm sure those of you who didn't already know what I meant about the sparks flying. Amazing how many things you packed into that speech that nonetheless was about the subject of today and yet about everything. So thank you, John. And maybe in the spirit of keeping us optimistic and reassured about the prospects of better government and public service, our next speaker is our own former Senator Tim Wirth. So he was a senator, that's the point, and he served in government for the state of Colorado, and we benefited tremendously from having him in office. And now Senator Wirth is the president of the UN Foundation, where he continues the life of public service, and we're just very fortunate that he could spend some time with us today.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning to all of you. I feel very privileged to be here today. I'm not a lawyer, but I was a great friend of David's, and to join you in reflecting on the life and work of David Getches, certainly one of the real treasures of our state of Colorado and the community of Boulder and the environment overall. This does feel a little bit like Old Home Week. Sarah, thank you for putting all of this together. Appreciate it. I'm sorry I missed Charles's discussion last night, but I went to a 9-year-old's lacrosse game, which was fascinating. But to see John Leshy here, John and Greg Hobbs helped on the last great big wilderness bill here. John was then working for Congressman George Miller as his counsel and helped us a lot on boundary issues, and Greg helped us sort through all of those tortuous reserve water rights issues. So the state of Colorado owes a great debt to the two of you. You may not have ever talked together about this, but both of you were very important to that happening. And seeing Chuck Howe here, who was always a tutor of mine in so many ways. And I love what Phil Weiser is now doing as the dean, sort of picking up, and particularly on the telecommunications work, which I found so enormously satisfying when I was in the House. Well, as I said, David was my friend, and we ran a lot of rivers together, talked a lot of politics, and he flattered me by inviting me many times to meet with his faculty and students. He recruited my son Christopher, one of his students, to be his assistant in the writing of a little book called Water Law in a Nutshell, which has a proud spot in our library. We all feel cheated by David's early departure. I think of punctual David. He was always on time. It's still a jolt to think of the late David Getches. And Anne, it's so great to have you here. I thought it was a terrific session down in Denver on Wednesday with your two daughters and your son, and it was just a wonderful reaching into the Denver community and getting them to express their appreciation of and gratitude for David. So it's always wonderful to see you. I would have valued David's counsel as ever we would have sat on a riverbank trying to puzzle through what had gone wrong in the country and what we might do about it. David and I, and many of you here today, were of a generation keenly aware of the opportunities that we've been given and of our responsibilities to assure that future generations had these opportunities as well. Like John Leshy, I'd like to frame my remarks in this generational context, and some of this will be familiar as it does echo much of John's thinking as well. We were products of a generation that made huge investments in our public spaces, our great public universities, remarkable advances in public health, public parks and public libraries, a vast public transportation system open to everyone, public electrification, public broadcasting, and a public interest standard to govern the public's airwaves. The public invested in the Marshall Plan, rebuilt our international financial institutions, and built the United Nations. For our lucky generation, these investments were governed by a broadly shared sense of public responsibility and the public interest. An unprecedented number of Americans benefited with a deep sense of possibility and optimism. David and much of his generation built another American structure on this public legacy and developed a new layer of common public institutions. The civil rights movement in all of its manifestations, women's access and equality, the voice of consumers, and perhaps most important right here, the environmental awakening. David was dedicated to making our country more economically, socially, and environmentally just. His record was, I'm sure, well laid out by Charles last night. He believed it was important to break down barriers to equal opportunity. He worked through his life to help to ensure that all Americans had access to educational experiences, those that underlie individual and social progress. He valued wilderness and the natural world and wanted to make sure that future generations could enjoy the same experiences he had had climbing the mountains of Colorado and running those rivers. Based on these values, David fought and won the Bolt decision that gave Native Americans in Washington access to salmon fisheries. He founded and ran for the Native American Rights Fund. His knowledge and work ethic made him a preeminent resource in the creation of wilderness areas and the establishment of water rights within them. He helped broker the agreement that recognized the water rights of the Southern Utes and the Mountain Ute tribes of southwest Colorado. And he created the Natural Resource Law Center, still growing here in the school. And as dean, he rebuilt this law school, as is reflected not only in the building, but in the diverse and dynamic scholars that he recruited. His life's work demonstrated that the law, the legislature, and the courts can be made to work for the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised, and the environment. But as David, even he, the cheerful optimist, often pointed out, this work was getting harder all the time. Our environment is more threatened than ever, with accurate measurements that tell this important and depressing story. The battles for equal opportunity have had mixed results at best, with income indices for minorities, immigration law, and even the rights of women now under broad assault. The gap between rich and poor has grown dramatically, while our historic investments in public institutions have frayed for one America, while the other America lives within a gated community with access to quality schools, good health care, and real economic opportunity. David would be wrapping his head around these huge challenges, urging his faculty to join, and leading his students in a set of new commitments for what is right for America. What's the role of corporations in governance? Is there an antidote to their enormous concentration of economic and political power? How should financial institutions be regulated? They were once considered akin to public utilities, and now seem to have become vehicles for private gain. Is this right? And if not, what's the solution? As John Leshy described so well, the executive and Congress are under attack, so too are the courts. Who else can adjudicate questions of the common good? And will they maintain this progressive role? Work used to be defined in much the same way. Everybody in our country did essentially the same thing, and so incomes were generally the same. But modern specialization has led to great disparities, and we have to ask ourselves, is capitalism too efficient? And if so, what kind of brakes do we put on this capitalist enterprise? Under what condition might our country and the world accept a climate treaty? John outlined this well. What building blocks must first be in place, and what new legal regimes will be required? Finally, and perhaps most important, how might we deal with the tangled and destructive campaign finance system? From the earliest days of the Republic, special interests have attempted to purchase politicians and political outcomes. What is different today is the size and pervasiveness of the money involved, the growing veil of secrecy surrounding political money, and the apparent naivete or indifference of our highest court to this powerful, corrupting, and stultifying political cancer. As Justice Stevens wrote in his Dissent to Citizens United, a democracy cannot function effectively when its constituent members believe that laws are being bought and sold. These are some of the major issues of today and tomorrow. As Sarah wrote in her invitation to the symposium, David lived several lives in one. His scholarship was as far-reaching as his curiosity, and grew to assume new challenges and to try to understand those challenges as well. As he opened up Indian law, forged some order from the chaos of water law, codified new approaches to natural resource law, and even tried to streamline and reform the Department of the Interior, David demonstrated his enormous capacity, his ethical standards for how we should operate, and his moral code of right and wrong. He had built his school, grown his faculty, and pointed the enterprise in the direction that he had calibrated. I am sure that he would have been turning his attention to the great emerging challenges of today, in the ways in which law could contribute. His cheerful leadership would have helped to sketch new definitions of the public good. We are left behind to do that work without him. I suspect we all know what he would have urged us to do. So I can only say, let's get with it before the country slips away. Time is short, and there is so much to do. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Senator Wirth. And so that gives us a lot to think about. And so we're going to take a break now until 9:45. That's amazing. We're ahead of schedule. That really is. I mean, it's a testament. These are really, it's an excellent speaker, right, who can say as much as these two have said and yet be ahead of schedule. So you have a little extra time, which means I hope we can all get back right on time and start the panel at 9:45. So it gives you a moment to mix and catch up and talk and so forth.